Without further ado, I will introduce you to Dr. Carmen Poulin. Dr. Poulin is the Associate Director of Arts and a Professor of Psychology and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of New Brunswick. Her research focuses on the impact of formal and informal social practices on women and marginalized groups' daily lives. Her research has examined the reality of numerous groups such as LGBTQ soldiers and their partners, Canadian women firefighters, 90-plus-year-old individuals living in place, informal caregivers, and women correctional officers, to name a few. She has had an ongoing interest in intersectionality as ascribed status and language-specific culture, intersectionality of ascribed status and language-specific culture, which has resulted in her research always taking into consideration the dual language realities of Canada and the New Brunswick context. In collaboration with Dr. Lynn Goliker, she is in the middle of a replication study on the experience of Canadian 2S LGBTQIA+ soldiers and their partners, and about to launch another study investigating the experience of Eastern Métis. Together, they are the co-developers of the Psychosocial Ethnography of the Commonplace methodology and the co-directors of the PSEC research group. Welcome, Dr. Poulin. We're very excited for your presentation this afternoon.
Merci beaucoup. And I will give my presentation in French as is listed in the program. So
Wonderful.
Just make sure that you've got you hit the right button for interpretation. I tested it this morning. It works beautifully. Merci aux interpréteurs, aux traductrices, aux traducteurs. Je sais que c'est un travail difficile. Je ne suis pas traductrice moi-même, mais quand j'essaye d'en faire un petit peu, c'est toujours un défi. Alors, merci infiniment. Et je vais essayer de parler pas trop rapidement, mais j'ai tendance à accélérer.
Thank you to the interpreters. I tend to speak too quickly. I must slow down. If you have questions, ask them in French or in English. I would be happy to answer them in your language of choice. I am starting, and I hope that you can see the presentation. Can you confirm that you can see the slide? Yes, I can see next to your face. Is it big enough to read? Now it is, yes.
Alors, quand ça va être important,
So, when it will be important to read, I will try to remember to make the screen bigger. I'm talking about the exclusion of women firefighters. And I added the name of Lynn Groutier because it's a study that both of us did together. She works at the Laurentides. We collaborate together for many years, and I would not have been able to do this presentation without her collaboration. So it's important for me to underline what it means to work with someone in this kind of project. We also have students who worked with us during the years, and I thank them as well. For example, Elisa Morris is a person who gave us a lot of help. To situate you in terms of the research done, women who are firefighters, even if the title doesn't say firefighters, I like to use the French pompiers because it gives us a clear indication that they are women. And what is their presence? The presence of women is not underlined, and I will come back to this, but to give you some numbers, some statistics, 7% of women are women, 13% in France, 4% in Germany, 4% in Norway, 3% in the United Kingdom, 12% in Taiwan. And for Canada, I have 4% because it was in 2017. It's a bit higher now, but not, it's between 4 and 5% presently. In terms of other careers or military or paramilitary careers, I will again give you to contextualize. I've tried that word 3 times. The context of what we're looking at in terms of the implication of women in this milieu. For example, women who are guards in penitentiaries, in average 32.3%, but when we look at the kind of institution, penitentiary where there are men mainly, the percentage is 26%, and institutions which are mainly for women, we have 68%, and establishments that have a mixed population, 29%. If we look at the armed forces, the Canadian Armed Forces, especially in the aviation, not quite 15%. It's a bit more than 15%, the Navy 18.4 and military 12.4. These are figures. We don't even get close to 50%, except when it's an institution that is mainly for women. And then I'm going to mention the police forces, 21.9%. But when we started our research, we thought it would be higher than what we found in other fields, especially in the military. But much to our surprise, we realized that women firefighters, it was where women were the least well represented.
Dans le milieu. L'autre question qu'on avait, on se demandait, bon, est-ce que les
The other question that we had, we were wondering, okay, so is the voluntary firefighters are those that are career firefighters? Because we know that the situation in Canada is not that everybody is paid for this type of work. There are certain compensations, but a lot of the work of firefighters is done on a voluntary basis. So we did not have the right numbers. So at that time, at the national level, we did not have the percentages in terms of statistics. The reality, actually, the reality is that in North America, we have many more firefighters, whether it's volunteers and, well, male and female firefighters, so not just women. If you look at my slide here, the comparison is great. There's 15% of women paid firefighters, 15%. And when we have 85% of volunteer firefighters or part-time firefighters for the various provinces are organized a little bit differently. And I will talk about this very quickly, again, to give you an idea about the situation. For example, in New Brunswick, we find that the firefighters, both male and female, work on a large part on a voluntary basis, and they are not remunerated as much as compensated. So there's a compensation, for example, in terms of tax returns, they can indicate that they are doing this work and there is a compensation. But in Quebec, it's part-time work in Quebec. And it's not very consistent, but it is almost like freelance work. So if somebody is available to fight a fire or to respond to an incident, they're paid for that incident, for example, but not full-time. So what do we find in terms of what do we have in terms of fire stations? First of all, it's a hierarchical and variable and decentralized practice. What do I mean by that? Is that the systems are very different. The leadership methods are very different from one to the next. Why? Because it's controlled on a municipal level, not provincial nor national. There are advantages to this because we see some variations. So some fire stations are more friendly, women friendly than others. But the reality is that generally speaking, when there is a practice that is a discriminatory practice, this is rather the rule than the exception. So to look in detail, so the organization is paramilitary, hierarchical. Fire services are municipal services, which means that this has an impact on the finances. There are important and significant differences in terms of regulations, in terms of policies, in terms of practices, and of funding the resources based on the region or the work location. Okay, so what do we see regarding from the research when we started? I just wanted to mention that we did this research, so it took us about 13 years, and the reason for this delay is that since it's a population, a marginalized population, before we could have a good pool of participants that was big enough, it took time. So maybe it's not 13, but it's approximately 10 years before we could have the number of participants that we could get, that we wanted to have. So what does the research, what was the research telling us at that time? To resolve this question very quickly is that people were telling us was a man's job. So it's a cultural thing. It's a masculine culture where there's harassment, where there's discrimination, and there's exclusion. It's a hostile environment and oftentimes, angry towards women. Yes, but your research took so long, but often, most likely, it really improved a lot since. Well, we can talk about this later, and I will talk about this later, but we also wondered, what is the difference between the experience of women that are career firefighters and volunteer firefighters? Is it different? Is, for example, in a volunteering environment, is there more supports for women rather than what we hear the experience are of career firefighters that are women? So the why of our research, we wanted to fill some voids. At that time in the media, there were stories that were horrible and that we could hear here and there. Media, not just social media, but traditional media, television, Radio Canada, CBC, etc. So there was a lack of academic research at the Canadian level to really understand whether the episodes we're hearing, are they one-off events? Are they exceptions? Or is it a common thread? And what we noticed very quickly is that we couldn't necessarily generalize American studies, for example, or United Kingdom studies, maybe because policies are not necessarily the same. We did not know. So we started with the idea that we have to document this in a more systematic way. And again, we wanted to see whether there was an experience between the career firefighters and the volunteer firefighters. Because in Canada and in North America, generally, it's the contingency of the number of these firefighters. And we're always talking about women firefighters. I don't know if you might remember, One of the stories that were the most dramatic that we heard that really motivated was the study was a woman in Richmond. There were 6 women that were hired at a time where there was introduced a quota was introduced to increase the women's presence. So these women had these labels, were labeled because they were hired only because the quota, rather than being hired for their competencies. So you have to say that to be a firefighter is very popular with the men and with many women, oftentimes because it's attracting, especially people that want to help, but also that want to have good working conditions. And in the big cities, the working conditions in the big cities are actually interesting. But at Richmond, there were 6 women that were labeled as having been hired only because they needed, a quota needed to be filled. And it was horrific for them. They all left the job. 2 committed suicide. These were dreadful. So this came out in the British Columbia in 2006. In 2015, there were reports in terms of the experience of women in Montreal and in their region. I say that in Montreal and Quebec made superhuman efforts to change the culture and to make it more open for the presence of women. And I wanted to thank somebody in particular at the end of my presentation that for the monumental efforts that they did to resolve this issue. And what were our research questions when we started? We wanted to know what was the experience of firefighters in Canada? How did they perceive the atmosphere in which they work? What direction, actually, how did they interpret their experiences if these experiences were negative? If their environment was hostile, how were they confronting this? How did they manage adversity in this non-traditional work? And what were the changes that could improve the situation for women firefighters? The methodology that we used was a methodology that we call a psychosocial ethnography of the daily activities. And I will use the English acronym called PSEC, and we did this with very specific objectives. First of all, we wanted it to be an interdisciplinary methodology that integrates not only our own personal disciplines. We wanted the psychology and sociology, but we also wanted the history and law, etc. And students helped us to shape our methodology so that it would be even more interdisciplinary. And by interdisciplinary, we wanted to take what was the best from all the other domains and to do something that would be useful in a qualitative fashion, the experience of those who were marginalized. And this was actually our first motivation in all of this. So PSEC is showing the functioning of organizations through marginalized groups' experiences. So what do I want to mean by this? Is that we're interested by the discrimination that's systemic, but we want to identify it through the experience of those that are not at the decision table. That means those that are marginalized in an institution, to understand what are the complications that these people have to be confronted with on a daily basis. That's the only way that we thought to see how their reality was harder rather than just look at the literature and understand the subject. We wanted to see the complications. When you're not part of the mechanism of decision to establish the way that things work on a daily basis. You're not impacting the system in which they find themselves. What creates that for you? It's a way of working that is making your life harder, and for someone else, maybe for males, white males or males that speak English, for example, in North America, for example. What does that mean? Because, for example, I'm white, European. I'm not born in Europe, but I'm born in Quebec. But what does that mean if I'm saying that I'm trying to understand the reality of someone who is Black, who comes from Africa, who's immigrant, a woman, and I don't know what else, other sectional variables, for example. Why? Because there's more chances that people like me were part of the decision tables to institute a particular culture in an organization. So what we wanted to go get is the experience of the marginalized people so that we could identify what practices would complicate their daily work. And then we could make these recommendations based on empirical data to understand what could help their experience. So how are we doing this? So I'm going to give you more technical details, and then I'm going to talk about the results. I'm going to stop talking about this more technical. So what are we looking for? We're looking at organizational moments. What are the criteria to determine an organizational moment? It has to benefit the organization, but also at the same time, it has to complicate the daily life of marginalized people. After that, what are we doing with once we analyzed an organizational moment? We're going to look at how people, that means marginalized people, how do they think about these complications to understand what do people think about this? For example, if we're going to say, and I'm going to give you an example in my daily life. I always give this example to my students. I like to teach at 8 o'clock in the morning. Students hate that. It's typical. They want to start their day, I don't know, at 10 maybe. But for me, I'm getting rid of that job because after that, I can do other work. I am vice dean, so I have many meetings. I'm able to have my free day. So to finish what I need to finish. But the students don't like that. But imagine if the students was his mom and she has to make sure that she's a mom, but she's a single mom, for example. I don't know the French expression. So she's a single mom, a single parent. That's the word that I forgot. So then she has to bring her little one to a daycare if she has space. But for me, I don't have a child. So for me, it's not important. But once I'm deciding that my course is going to be at 8, do I think about her reality or to mine? I don't think about her reality. I think about mine. Otherwise, I would decide to have my class later. So this give you just a way to think about an organizational moment. But how do we think about it? Well, there's somebody that has to teach at 8:30. We have to bring people in our courses, in our classes. It's normal that we have 8:30 classes. So this whole reading of this reality that we don't question, it's normal. There are classes at 8:30. It could be mine or it could be someone else's. After that, then we identify how do people have a tendency to interpret their experiences. And then we're going to look at the what are the strategies they're using to adapt themselves to the situation. So they're going to develop various strategies, cognitive strategies, so that it's logical, so that they're not always faced with these contradictions, and also behavioral strategies. So they're going to develop things, behaviors to surmount their adversities. After that, we're going to look at the institutional changes that can be brought to actually make their daily life easier. If you have questions, please ask me, and please interrupt me, because I would be happy to answer. Not for now. It's very interesting. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the research protocol, the interviews took between 2 to 4 hours. It took a lot of time. It's various tiring for the interviewers and interviewees, but what we're told all the time, that it's an experience that is 20 years old and over. It's oftentimes the first time that they can talk about their experience, because nobody worried about whether their experience was a daily one or not. So we thought to ourselves, well, when we're doing something, at least we're going to have an undivided attention. We were focused on them. If it can help them to at least to have a voice, we take advantage of that, and then we continue this research. And we had some success in the years to change the policies. So it's always the side that we like to think about. So the PSEC analysis, we're
Alors là, vous êtes équipés, là, vous savez exactement comment on
you're
procède.
equipped
Et,
exactly how we proceed. And I'm going to go back to my sample before, but I want to quickly tell you that we interviewed we have 113, but it's a little bit more like 116 interviewees. It's a detail of a few hours when we consider the hours it takes to interview every person, but it's important. The age was between 19 to 64 years old, and the average was about 40 years old. Years of service was between 5 to 37 years. The average was 10.4 hours, so it's a very good group. It's a pan-Canadian study, so we had representation in all the provinces and all the territories. The distribution of the participants' age, you can see here what it is. When we're looking at less than 20 years old, it's very little. We look at the various bars, whether they're volunteers, career, firefighters, or both, who had both experiences in orange. So you see here, it's a curve that's pretty normal based on age. But we can also notice that there's a group of people that have between 60 to 64, who are 60 to 64. Sorry, when we're thinking about women firefighters, that's pretty impressive. One moment, I did something that I shouldn't have done. It's clear that our sample was mainly volunteers and part-time workers. We have 1/4 of our sample that were career firefighters, and in orange there were the two experiences. So what the firefighters often do, women and men, they start by being a volunteer because it gives them a higher chance of being hired in a job, to get a job in the future. Another thing that I wanted to show is in our sample, I told you that there's a hierarchy. So there are some firefighters that are doing inspections at 4%. Some are prevention agents or prevention officers. Then some are directors or chiefs or chief deputies. Some are lieutenants and some are captains. 74% of our samples were first line firefighters. So before going to the next point, even though 74% are first line firefighters, you might think that all they're doing is that they, fight fires. But in reality, this work represents less than 2% of the calls that they respond to. So the job of a firefighter, yes, it's a job that they obviously fight fires, but they do much more than that, and it's very varied. They respond to an accident, they respond to various different calls. I remember an anecdote. We were in France for our first sabbatical year, and there was a cat that was yeah, they were caught in a tree. That cat was caught in a tree, and they called the firefighters there, sapeurs-pompiers, and so that the cat could come down. And I said to myself, I've seen it all. So the firefighters do a whole bunch of things. So what did the women firefighters tell us? We're going back to our questions and our problem, principal problem. Oh, I jumped. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, this slide is in English. I didn't translate it. I did the translation, but I forgot this page. I'm sorry, but I'm going to talk about it still. There are various organizational moments. Here I have 7 that I listed. The other criteria to identify an organizational moment is that it has to be repeated more than an interview. It doesn't have to be repeated in every interview, but we have to recognize a pattern in the women's experiences before mentioning that it is a problem experience and a systemic problem. The first one, and we spoke about this much. If there are questions, I would be happy to answer them, is the entire question of how women are dressed, women firefighters, and it's a big problem, especially in regions where women are working on a volunteer basis. I'm going to give you a quick summary. For example, when a woman comes, she's, let's say, 5 feet tall, she's strong, she's motivated, she's young, full of energy. Are we going to buy her vestments that are going to cost more than $2,000 so that she can join the group? Or we're going to ask her to wear something that's way too big for her? That includes the boots, that includes the gloves. The jacket is really not made for her. And what's going to happen is that the budget is limited, and they're going to say, well, yeah, but women, they oftentimes don't stay long, and she's going to have children, etc. She's not going to stay as a firefighter for long. So there's a discrimination, and it becomes a financial argument. So that definitely affects women in a disproportionate manner compared to the men, but we can defend the decisions. It's a small community. They don't have a lot of money. So financially, it's not logical to buy vestments and gear that is so expensive. That's a reality that we often heard. There's even firefighters that will spend the money and they will buy the gear that they need that suits them because they want to do that work and because there's no budget to buy it for them. So in any case, when the firefighters start as volunteers, they don't have a new gear. And that's normal, we could say. But when there's no new gear or even old that is suitable for you, if we're going up the staircase or to work with our hands because we have to hold a big a hose, for example. So we have to wear four pairs of socks, and we have to go up a ladder. We're gonna be in danger. We're gonna have to be much more careful than Bob next to us that has gear that suits him. So that's giving you an example of the problem. So we've documented this. There's a lot of different examples, different aspects of that are problematic. Also, that women spoke about harassment, discrimination. In Canada, we also have a hostile environment towards women, and it is more, pretty macho. Women have colleagues or or they have children themselves or have colleagues that had children or were pregnant. They had systemic problems. And is it whether the gear is not adapted? And it's oftentimes because they were identified as being pregnant because they don't always want to mention it, because if they say it, automatically we stop them from doing their work, or we're going to exclude them. So it complicates their life. So if on top of that, so then they're categorized and labeled as they're not really committed towards their work. So maternity for women firefighters, to be pregnant, for their reputation, etc. So we oftentimes heard this, many women that had that experience. It was never a joyful moment. That's how I'm going to say it. Then the culture. The culture is masculine, that was developed by men for men, and women are excluded of that. And so oftentimes men will join. This is also from the point of view of the women. Oftentimes men will join this job, get this job to be amongst men only. So they want to do activities, male activities, right? So unless they're involving their family, for example, for the weekend barbecue, for example. So the experience of being excluded, for example, or of becoming the person that's different, women, for women, it's hard to avoid that. Even if they are, even the firefighters are Black, they have a different experience. We spoke about this in an formal way with firefighters when we went to Montreal to discuss of the situation with the city, to see how they could modify this practice. There were some men that were racialized, but their experience is different. It's unique. And women, so when they're Black, so this is what we noticed. So it's to them that we spoke. We had a few women that were Indigenous and a few that were immigrants. But really, it's not a workplace that's open to diversity. So we see very few. In our study, it was very hard to try to get a group that was big enough to get conclusions regarding these questions. So the only question that we were able to better understand was the question of age. A woman gets older, and when I say older, we just mean 40 years old and more. So that's, in my books, it's mainly it's a young age because I'm 60 and over. But when we're 40 years older, so in the women's firefighters life, and even with men, we consider them old. But male firefighters are not suffer, because they can usually typically go up the ladder and and get jobs that require less physicality, and so the discrimination is not prominent. They're not confronted with discrimination based on that, and there's a certain tolerance for the age that men benefit from, and for women it's not part of their reality.
Finalement, le dernier point que je veux mentionner au niveau
The last thing that I want to mention in terms of organizational movements are cancer risks. As you can imagine, male and female firefighters face many carcinogenic chemical products, and there are cancers which are more common with them, and work insurance covers those cancers. But before a cancer is recognized as being a risk, the insurance companies must accept it. Unfortunately, there are no epidemiological studies that are important enough that include enough women to gather statistics where the probability can be specified. So we don't have those numbers. And we cannot identify cancers linked to reproduction organs, uterus, cervical cancer, breast cancer, etc. And as well, I mentioned Elisa Summer went back to school. We have just lost her from our team, and she's going to do graduate studies on epidemiology, and that's the subject that interests her. We want to do a more detailed study with other countries to gather enough women to have a sampling which will give us data which is more representative in terms of the presence of cancer among women. But it's a question of numbers at this point. So what have they told us? I will give you how they speak of it. I know that the translators have this, at least I hope they have the slides. An example in terms of the traditional masculinity, it's an ideal, it's celebrated. I spoke to it. We hear Janine, who says she's a career firefighter. I must also give 110%, 120%. But if there's one day that I'm not in good shape, to have to start at zero. When she says start again at zero, it's her reputation that is speaking of. It's a sliding scale. They have to regain their confidence and come back to the point where they think they can depend on you and you've earned your place in the team. It's sure that firefighters work as a team when they're in a dangerous situation where they really need to work not individually but together. It's very important to have confidence in the team members for your security and for the security of everyone involved. So we can see the importance of feeling like you're part of the team. It's the same dynamic as in police services and in the army. The team spirit is very important. They are programmed to think of it in such a way. And it influences their work as such. If a woman doesn't perform 150% of her capacity, she always risks to lose the confidence of her colleagues, the confidence that she worked hard to get, and then she has to restart. I'm going to read another example. I hope that I don't have much time, but I'm going to try to read in examples of a few organizations. When we try to work in both languages, it becomes complicated when we're not a translator. Certain officers, Chantal is speaking to us, certain officers are there for what, 25, 30 years? They did not think that women could do this in their time, and our presence always bothers them. Really, they have problems with women, it's obvious, and most of them are aware of it. But what can we do? We just have to wait for them to retire. So the hope that the culture will change, it was discouraging to hear this from women, because there were some sad situations. It was so hard to hear them, and they lost hope. They have careers, long careers. To be ostracized every day is really tremendous. And when we speak of these women, we're talking about super women. They're strong. They know how to defend themselves. They don't need, I don't know how to say it. They're not fragile. They're trained and they're happy to be in great physical shape with great strength. Question of aggression and bullying. Before getting in my bed, again, a career firefighter has said this, a woman firefighter. Before getting into bed, we have the habit of looking at the sheets. We think we're going to find something in our locker. We're not surprised if our equipment has been vandalized. The simple fact to be able to be ready for this allowed me to spend 31 years in the firefighting service. I never cried, I never said anything. Obviously, they choose to remain silent because saying something will automatically increase the feeling of being apart from the group. Must they risk this? Most of the women rarely speak to whomever about those experiences. And when they speak of it, they pay the price. And it can go as far as recently, I think it's less than 5 years ago, there was a case in Newfoundland where the woman complained that she was bullied, and the whole team of the station resigned as a group, but she was all alone. She was a victim. She was all alone without a defense. Even if she had gone to the media, she never found her career again. The community, the small community, needed its firefighters. So it was a very efficient way of getting rid of her. This is the kind of behavior that they face, that women firefighters face. The next situation, it's long, so I'm going to resume. She was sexually assaulted by a colleague, and she didn't want to tell anyone because of the price she would have to pay. But she saw that he was doing the same thing with a new female recruit, and she said to herself, he won't do it again. So she went outside the system. She never spoke to her superiors because she said it would be under the rug. She went to the police and she made a formal complaint. She was lucky because she used an exterior system. Because had she stayed within the firefighting system, she probably would have had the same future that the woman in Newfoundland had.
Bon, signaler un harcèlement. Je vais sauter parce que j'aimerais ça qu'on
I'm gonna move ahead because I'd like to have some time for questions.
Exclusion sociale et marginalisation. Ça, c'est vraiment
Excuses, social exclusion and marginalization. It's very sad. As a group, they tolerate you. Those are the key words. You are tolerated. What Barbara is trying to say, that you're never part of the gang. We are tolerated because we have to, they have to tolerate us. It's not like all women are excluded to the point where they say this, but it was still a very common sentiment. It was the norm rather than the exception, but there are exceptions, and I want to speak of them. I'm going to read another one. We feel alone. When I started as a volunteer firefighter, the the alarm would ring in the middle of the night, and when I would get there, the truck was already gone, and that was told to us frequently. There was a hall in the middle of the fire station where the guys waited for the trucks to come back. When I entered, the men would leave one by one to go talk somewhere else. And I was left there, sitting there alone. Many guys became volunteer firefighters so they could get away from their wives, so they could spend time with the guys and be guys. My presence denied them that in intimacy. So she understands the dynamic. She's even sympathetic to it. I remember that. It's probably the extreme, but she understood. She understood. Her father had been a firefighter. It's a man's world. You have to expect it. All of this to say, I'm going to come back to the end, otherwise I will speak too much, to look at different aspects, the culture. It's important to say we celebrate the masculine culture. Bullying and aggression is present. Many women describe these to us. Sexual assaults, the negative reaction of colleagues, of female colleagues when you complain. If you think that the other female firefighters are going to support you, you are wrong, as we were wrong. What happens if one speaks, everyone must be victimized by the circumstances. Even if the others have the same experiences, all of a sudden nobody trusts the women. We exclude them, we separate them, we distance them, and everyone suffers of this discrimination, that they're not included in the gang. So it's not as if women can expect or hope for their colleagues or female colleagues to be there with them. The atmosphere is so toxic. It's not likely to happen. After which, I gave you examples of marginalization and exclusion, the logistical elements, equipment, which makes things worse. It's difficult to show how you can perform if your equipment doesn't fit you. Psychological effects, your concerns. We had many, but women can't speak of it because it's a man's world. You have to be strong, you have to be tough. Concerns about physical health, I spoke of it too. They take more risk because they can't allow themselves to be seen as being weak or to being less capable or not giving 150%. So a greater risk of being wounded. The concerns about physical health, cancer, I spoke of it. Concerns about physical health when it comes to cleaning the equipment. The equipment must be clean, it must be safe, except that because of the tradition that we have been a experienced firefighter, unless it's there are laws, unless things are cleaned in such a way. In rural areas, the things are not cleaned properly, because if it's a clean outfit, it means you didn't work. You didn't really do your best. You weren't really there. So we tend to keep the clothing less than clean. It's part of the macho culture that you always have to be there. And women talk of the impact of 9/11. the crisis of the World Trade Towers, because after which firefighters were treated more so as superheroes. We didn't think of that, but we were quite surprised to find out that that moment, the historic moment, made things more difficult for women. I don't want to end that way. I want to end with a quote, the Ivy. She says something that we heard from most of the women we interviewed, regardless of the context, the hostile context in which they work, they love their work. As they say, it's the best job in the world. Here is a good example. I got a false cancer diagnostic, breast cancer in my first year. It was very interesting to hear this. And she explained that it could be great if there is a good team spirit, because when she was diagnosed with cancer, her colleagues, her male colleagues, didn't know which saint to pray to. I'll bring you to the doctor, one would say. I will walk your dog, another would say. I'll make you something to eat. If you need whatever, tell me. The chief, station chief, behaved the same way. I had a system of support that was amazing. You cannot imagine how great it was. It's certain that these women, can you see still? I'm sorry. These women are part of a group that want to help people. When they become a victim, she didn't have cancer in this case, the group became like a family. We're going to save her, we're going to help her. So it is a work environment that can be very supportive when you're part of the gang. So that in the end is what's at play, how to become a member of the gang if you're a woman. And unfortunately, it's very difficult. I want to thank somebody in particular. I want to thank Annick Saint-Pierre, who was really a link between many female firefighters and ourselves. She worked a lot for women firefighters in Quebec. I also want to thank the Research Fund of the University of New Brunswick, the Canadian Social Sciences Research Council, the Health Foundation in New Brunswick for the financial support to do this study, and obviously the female firefighters that agreed to share their story with us. Without them, nothing would have happened. We were able to do this research because they exist and they accepted to be interviewed. I promise that it's the last slide. The recommendations we recommend, Aline and I, we have many. These are a few. We must find a way to pay, and we found models that could be adopted nationally to pay for the purchase of equipment which is suitable for female firefighters and is secure for them. Prevention and intervention against bullying and sexual aggression must happen, especially in military and paramilitary groups. We know that we have to go outside of those organizations to find programs to address these issues. It is important because within the system, it doesn't work. We have to have coherent policies. We must have organizations nationally and provincially that have rules that all small municipalities must respect. Otherwise, there's all kinds of arbitrary rules at the municipal level, which means that marginal groups have a terribly negative experience. Many people are lost. Many people who are trained that could help us are lost. And finally, we must do research on the cancers which are common amongst the female firefighters. We had the idea of having a study at the world level. Probably it can be worldly, but with many countries. But this will take time. It's going to cost a lot of money. We need to find a way to convince insurance companies that women are worth it. And even if there's a doubt, it's not 100% certain that the cancer is caused by that risk, we can probably do studies, case studies, which will inform us as to the risk and improve their situation when they suffer from cancer. I will end here. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions. That's it. Thank you.
Sont les prochaines étapes de cette recherche?
What are the next stages of this research? Did the research bring up new questions which needed to be explored? For us, the next steps, we're making recommendations. We have completed the most of our research, unless we have students who want to look at different aspects. We are publishing our results and we are creating the means to have an impact with our results. We want to inform governments, especially municipal governments. We're speaking of our research to give ideas to fire stations to create systems which make more sense. And there are examples. We had an example in the Maritimes, which was very interesting in terms of the equipment for women. They had created a means by which women, when they were called to intervene, when they were kids, that there was a system in place to pay for childcare. Because at 3 in the morning, it's complicated to have a sitter for your children. But they worked on it because there were women who were trained, equipped, and had children and had to otherwise quit all of it. What a loss of important resource, and it didn't make sense. So there are people who have creative thinking skills and people who think more progressively, but it was really the exception rather than the rule.
Qui sont bénévoles. Alors, c'est important que les petites municipalités et les groupes bénévolents, ils ne peuvent pas eux-mêmes.
It makes sense that small municipalities depend more on volunteers. To make things better for small stations. I'm sorry, the interpreter regrets, but she has difficulty understanding and hearing Nicole.
Rural
communities, volunteers are aging. Have you looked at the tendencies between young firefighters and firefighters with a lot of experience? That's a good question. We thought, and many women told us, we have to wait for the old, I'm part of it, that the older people retire, and then we will have people who are less caught up in stereotypes. It's not what happened. The young have to fit in their culture as well, and they learn very quickly. Even if the older men have retired, they've left their culture behind. Absolutely. Now, sometimes, and we heard of it, the younger will be more open when they're just with a woman. They'll say, yeah, I know, I agree with you, but I didn't want to talk about it because if I talk about it, I will pay the price. So it's always the issue of, if you go against the grain, what is the price you pay? The love of fire, as we've said it before, of that profession that unfortunately there are plenty of stereotypes. Even women will internalize.
Internalize, c'est ça.
They will internalize their sense of not being worthy. They'll say, it's true, I'm smaller. If somebody's 5'4", it's true. I ask myself, am I the weak link in the team? But think about it.
Frame, comme on dit en anglais.
If you don't have a small body frame, if you're a small woman or a small man, because there are some of those as well, what do you do when you have an upside down car in which you have to slide into a window to open, or you have to use the jaws of life?
Comment ça se dit en français? Puis que faut que tu sois tout petite pour passer.
And you have to be tiny to do that, to help the person who is caught inside. What we need in a practical and obvious way is diversity. You need diversity of capacity in terms of physical shape, in terms of emotions. When there are problems with women who are pregnant and they are about to deliver a baby, the women are just pushed into the situation because the guys all of a sudden know nothing. So you need that diversity. You need to give value to it all. The culture must adapt itself. Thank you very much.
I'm going to call us to a close.
Thanks for staying all day and give your presentation. I'm going to close for today.
I'd love for anyone who isn't already planning on coming, have a look at those agendas, decide if you want to come to any of them, come to any or all of them. I'm going to be here for the next 2 days straight. We're going to have some wonderful presentations on. Tomorrow is tips and tricks for creating healthy workplaces. And then on Thursday, we're focusing on trauma-informed workplaces. Today's conversation on systemic racism in the workplace has been incredibly interesting. I think we've had a really broad range of perspectives looking at not only women in more typically male heavy work environments like Dr. Poulin has done with her research, but also looking at indigenous employees and bringing reconciliation into the workplace, looking at people of color and bringing the view of the Commissioner on Systemic Racism in New Brunswick, and talking about the Human Rights Commission and the ways that the Human Rights Commission can have a role in that. We even had Mayor Rogers speaking this morning about the work of reconciliation that the City of Fredericton is doing. And though that work might be at a municipal level, I think that it really does make, I think that every time we have changes at any level, I think as a lot of our speakers, as Dr. Poulin has identified today, a lot of our speakers have identified, change at every level brings changes to places like our workplaces. Changes in those culture mean that we're going to have stronger cultures in our workplaces. So thank you so much for all your wonderful participation today. And I hope you all have a lovely and sunny afternoon.
And I just want to take this opportunity to thank the organizer. Thank you, Nicole. You've been amazing. And Shelley, this morning was great, and all of the people, Brownwind, etc., that were involved, because it was ran really very well. Thank you. And I know what it's like because I've organized a few.
Before we leave, Dr. Poulin, there's a comment in the Q&A that's directed for you. So I'll leave that for you to access and maybe take offline. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful, folks. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you all, or some of you, tomorrow.